A quiet suburban home, a drunken intruder, and a pack of stray cats that would change everything. What happened next left an entire neighborhood in tears. The night was pitch black, broken only by flickering streetlights. In a sleepy cul-de-sac, most houses were dark. But at 42 Maple Street, a lone figure stumbled up the driveway. It was Jack Thompson, swaying on unsteady feet, fumbling with his keys. The neighbors knew Jack, a good man, but one who'd been hitting the bottle hard since losing his job. Tonight, though, something was different. Jack wasn't heading for his own house. He was at number 44, the home of elderly Mrs. Peterson. Jack's alcohol-addled mind had convinced him this was his place. As he jammed his key uselessly into the lock, frustration grew. With a sudden burst of misguided strength, he shouldered the door. It gave way with a sickening crack. Inside, 82-year-old Edna Peterson jolted awake, heart pounding. The sounds of someone stumbling around downstairs froze her with terror. She reached for her phone with trembling hands, but in her panic, it clattered to the floor. Outside, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the bushes. Then another, and another. You see, for months now, a colony of stray cats had been quietly making their home in Mrs. Peterson's overgrown yard. She'd leave scraps out for them sometimes, earning their trust. But tonight, as Jack's drunken muttering drifted through the broken door, those cats sensed something was very wrong. The pack emerged from the shadows, 7 of them, moving as one silent unit. They slipped through the open door, padding silently across the carpet. Upstairs, Mrs. Peterson could hear heavy footsteps on the stairs. Closer, closer. She closed her eyes, praying for a miracle. And that's when it happened. A chorus of angry yowls erupted from the hallway. The sound of multiple bodies hitting the floor. Jack's confused shouts, and then silence. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, they found a scene that left them speechless. Jack Thompson lay unconscious at the bottom of the stairs, covered in scratches, and surrounding him, standing guard like tiny, furry sentinels, were 7 street cats. The officers moved cautiously past this unlikely security team to find Mrs. Peterson shaken but unharmed. As the story spread, the neighborhood was stunned. These strays, often seen as nuisances, had become unexpected heroes. But let's rewind. How did we get here? What series of events led to this extraordinary night? It all began 6 months earlier, on a blistering hot day in July. Mrs. Peterson, arthritic hands wrapped around a watering can, shuffled out to tend her wilting roses. That's when she first spotted him. A scrawny orange tabby, ribs visible through matted fur, peering out from beneath her hydrangea bush. Mrs. Peterson's heart melted. "Oh, you poor thing," she cooed, setting down her watering can. Slowly, carefully, she made her way back inside, returning moments later with a chipped saucer of milk and some leftover tuna. The cat watched warily as she set the offerings on the ground and backed away. Mrs. Peterson settled into her porch rocker, content to wait. An hour passed before hunger finally overcame caution. The tabby crept forward, lapping desperately at the milk. "There you go, sweetheart," Mrs. Peterson murmured. "You're safe here." Little did she know, this simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. Over the next few weeks, the orange tabby became a regular visitor. Mrs. Peterson named him Rusty for his vibrant coat. Soon, Rusty wasn't alone. A sleek black cat she called Shadow started appearing alongside him. Then came a calico she dubbed Patches, a gray tom she named Smokey, and 3 young kittens, Whiskers, Mittens, and Socks. Mrs. Peterson's backyard became a sanctuary for these forgotten felines. She'd sit for hours, watching them play and doze in the sun. For the first time since her husband passed, the elderly woman felt truly alive again. But not everyone shared Mrs. Peterson's enthusiasm for her new furry friends. "Those mangy creatures are a menace," huffed Mrs. Higgins from next door, peering over the fence with narrowed eyes. "They'll attract vermin. They'll spread disease. Other neighbors muttered similar concerns. Stray cats were a nuisance, they argued. They yowled at night, fought loudly, and used flower beds as litter boxes. There was talk of calling animal control, of setting traps. Mrs. Peterson was heartbroken. How could they not see the beauty, the worth of these animals? She'd come to know each cat's unique personality. Rusty, brave and protective. Shadow, shy but affectionate once she earned his trust. Patches, playful and mischievous. The kittens, bundles of pure joy. But as weeks turned to months, something remarkable began to happen. The neighborhood kids, initially warned to stay away, grew curious about Mrs. Peterson's feline visitors. They'd stop by after school, asking to pet the friendly ones, giggling as kittens chased bits of string. Mrs. Peterson would beam, sharing little stories about each cat. "Did you know," she'd say, eyes twinkling, "that Rusty here once chased away a raccoon twice his size? And Shadow, oh, he may look tough, but he's the biggest cuddle bug once he warms up to you." The children's enthusiasm was contagious. Soon, their parents started dropping by too, drawn in by their kids' excited chatter. They'd bring old blankets for the cats to sleep on or leftover chicken from Sunday dinners. Even grumpy Mrs. Higgins found herself won over, grudgingly admitting that the yard looked better now that the cats kept the mice population in check. As summer faded into autumn, the mood on Maple Street had shifted. The stray cats were no longer seen as pests, but as valued members of the community. They had names now, personalities. People looked out for them. But while most of Maple Street was embracing this newfound harmony, one house remained stubbornly dark. Jack Thompson's home at number 42 stood out like a sore thumb. Overgrown lawn, peeling paint, newspapers piling up on the porch. The neighbors whispered about him. How he'd lost his job at the factory after 25 years. How his wife had left, taking the kids. How the bottle had become his closest companion. They'd tried to help at first. Invitations to backyard barbecues. Offers to mow his lawn. But Jack had retreated further and further into himself, until even a nod of acknowledgement became rare. Mrs. Peterson's heart ached for him. She remembered Jack from better days. Coaching Little League, always quick with a joke and a helping hand. Now, he was a ghost of his former self. She tried leaving casseroles on his porch, but they'd sit untouched until the neighborhood raccoons claimed them. Her gentle inquiries were met with grunted dismissals. Still, she persisted, convinced that the Jack she knew was still in there somewhere. As autumn chill gave way to winter's bite, concern for Jack grew. His truck hadn't moved in weeks. The lights rarely came on. Some neighbors wanted to call social services, but Mrs. Peterson pleaded for patience. "He's hurting," she'd say. "We can't give up on him." Little did anyone know, Jack's pain was about to collide with Mrs. Peterson's compassion in a way no one could have predicted. It was a Friday night in early December. A bitter wind howled down Maple Street, rattling windows and sending dead leaves skittering across frosted lawns. Most families were huddled inside, grateful for warm fires and hot cocoa. In her cozy living room, Mrs. Peterson dozed in her favorite armchair, a patchwork quilt draped over her lap. On the floor nearby, Rusty and Shadow curled together in a furry yin-yang. The other cats were tucked away in the heated shelter the neighbors had helped build in the backyard. A sudden crash jolted Mrs. Peterson awake. Rusty's ears went flat against his head, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Shadow darted under the sofa. "What on earth?" Mrs. Peterson murmured, struggling to her feet. Another crash, followed by the sound of breaking glass. It was coming from next door, from Jack's house. Heart racing, Mrs. Peterson hobbled to her window. Through the gloom, she could make out a figure staggering up Jack's driveway. Even from this distance, she could smell the reek of whiskey. "Oh, Jack," she sighed. "What have you done to yourself?" She watched as he fumbled with his keys, dropping them twice before managing to retrieve them. But instead of heading for his own front door, Jack veered left, stumbling onto Mrs. Peterson's porch. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter night ran down her spine. Jack was trying to get into her house. He must be confused, she whispered to herself. He doesn't know where he is. She should call the police. That would be the sensible thing to do. But as she watched Jack struggle with the lock, all Mrs. Peterson could see was a man drowning in his own sorrow. She took a step towards the door, intending to open it, to guide Jack gently back to his own home. But before she could reach it, a sickening crack split the air. Jack had thrown his weight against the door, and the ancient lock had given way. Mrs. Peterson stumbled backward, terror seizing her heart. This wasn't the Jack she knew. This was a stranger, unpredictable and dangerous. She turned to flee up the stairs, but her arthritic knees betrayed her. She fell, crying out in pain. Her phone, knocked from the side table, skittered across the floor and under a cabinet. Downstairs, she could hear Jack stumbling around, muttering incoherently. His heavy footsteps started up the stairs. Mrs. Peterson dragged herself into her bedroom, closing the door with trembling hands. Tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks as she prayed for a miracle. And that's when she heard it, a symphony of angry yowls, followed by startled shouts and the thud of bodies hitting the floor. For several heart-stopping moments, chaos reigned. Then silence. Mrs. Peterson held her breath, straining to hear. Nothing. Then a soft scratch at her bedroom door, a familiar meow. With shaking hands, she turned the knob. There, sitting proudly in the hallway, was Rusty. Behind him, the other cats had formed a protective semicircle around Jack's prone form at the bottom of the stairs. Relief washed over Mrs. Peterson like a tidal wave. She sank to her knees, gathering Rusty into her arms. "Oh, you brave, wonderful boy," she sobbed. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police sirens pierced the night. Neighbors in pajamas and hastily thrown-on coats gathered on the sidewalk, whispering in shocked tones. Jack was taken away in an ambulance, still unconscious but stable. The scratches from the cats were superficial, but he'd have one hell of a headache when he woke up. As dawn broke over Maple Street, the full magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. The stray cats, once considered nuisances, had potentially saved Mrs. Peterson's life. The story spread like wildfire, first through the neighborhood, then to local news stations. By the end of the week, national media had picked it up. Hero cats foiled drunken break-in, the headlines blared. Animal lovers across the country were captivated. Donations poured in: cat food, beds, toys, and cash to cover veterinary expenses. The Maple Street Seven, as the cats were dubbed, became instant celebrities. But for Mrs. Peterson and her neighbors, the cats' heroic act was secondary to a much more important realization. They had failed Jack Thompson. "We should have done more," Mrs. Higgins said, voice thick with emotion, at an emergency neighborhood meeting. "We saw he was struggling and we just let him fade away." Heads nodded in solemn agreement. There were tears, recriminations, but ultimately a renewed sense of purpose. "It's not too late," Mrs. Peterson insisted. "Jack needs us now more than ever." And so, as Jack recovered in the hospital, Maple Street mobilized. They cleaned his house from top to bottom, repaired the sagging porch, stocked his fridge with home-cooked meals. But most importantly, they made a pact. No one on Maple Street would ever feel that alone again. When Jack was released a week before Christmas, he came home to a transformed house and a second chance. The road to recovery wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of despair. But Jack wasn't fighting alone anymore. Mrs. Peterson's cats played an unexpected role in his healing. At first, Jack was wary of them, embarrassed by his actions that night. But Rusty, ever the ambassador, won him over with persistent headbutts and rumbling purrs. Jack found solace in caring for the cats. The simple act of filling food bowls and changing litter boxes gave his day structure. Brushing their fur and playing with bits of string brought moments of joy he hadn't felt in years. As winter melted into spring, Jack Thompson emerged from his cocoon of grief and addiction. He found a job at the local community center, teaching woodworking to at-risk youth. His lawn was once again the envy of the neighborhood, and every evening, without fail, he'd join Mrs. Peterson on her porch. Sometimes they'd talk for hours, Jack opening up about his struggles, his fears, his hopes for the future. Other times, they'd simply sit in companionable silence, watching the cats play in the twilight. One balmy evening in late May, as fireflies began to dance in the gathering dusk, Jack turned to Mrs. Peterson with tears in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, voice rough with emotion. "You and these cats, you saved my life. Not just that night, but every day since." Mrs. Peterson patted his hand, her own eyes glistening. "Oh, Jack," she said softly, "don't you see? We saved each other." As night fell over Maple Street, the porch light cast a warm glow over an extraordinary scene. An elderly woman and a man reborn, surrounded by 7 contented cats. A picture of redemption, of second chances, of the healing power of compassion, both human and feline. The story of the Maple Street 7 and the night that changed everything became legend. It was told and retold, passed down through generations. Parents used it to teach their children about kindness, about not judging others, about the unexpected ways heroes can appear in our lives. But for those who lived it, the true miracle wasn't just what happened that fateful night. It was what came after. A neighborhood transformed, lives rebuilt, a community that learned to truly see and care for one another. And at the heart of it all, 7 ordinary cats who proved that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism come from the most unexpected places. As you reflect on this incredible tale, ask yourself, how can you be more like Mrs. Peterson in your own life? Where might you extend kindness to those others have given up on? What, stray cats, in your world might be secret blessings in disguise? Remember, it's often the smallest acts of compassion that ripple outward, changing lives in ways we can never predict. So the next time you see someone struggling or encounter an animal in need, pause. Reach out. You never know. You might just be writing the first chapter of your own miraculous story. If this tale touched your heart, make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories that remind us of the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals. Together, we can create a world where kindness and second chances aren't just the stuff of legends, but everyday realities. In the end, the legacy of Maple Street wasn't just about 7 heroic cats. It was about the transformative power of compassion, the strength found in community, and the beautiful truth that it's never too late for a new beginning. So tonight, as you go to sleep, remember the lesson of Rusty, Shadow, and their feline friends. Heroes come in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes they even purr. And who knows, the next time you hear a meow at your door, it might just be the sound of your life changing forever.